Hi everyone, Patricia Worby Alchemy Therapies here. Today I want to talk about something which is very, very common and people don't realise, and that is a form of trauma called spiritual bypassing. And I'm going to refer to a piece of work by Dr. Miles Neal from the Nalanda Institute for Contemplative Science. Really, but this is to do with trauma in childhood and how a lot of people are drawn to a spiritual practice, but instead of that becoming part of their growth, becomes a way that they can avoid their trauma and avoid their bodies and avoid their emotional responses. And so it then becomes coercive and dangerous. And so I'm going to read some parts of this document and then I'm going to tell you my interpretation of that. And so first of all, a definition of spiritual bypassing is a widespread tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. In other words, your development is halted in some way and you become stuck. You are using spirituality to avoid shame and pain. And I have seen this so much because I'm involved in various groups that have, a spiritual content. I myself have an involvement in a group that works on spirituality because we see it as such a vital part of growth and development. But there's a lot of people hiding out in there. And I know because recently I've had some interaction where I've managed to call out some things and people have responded quite badly because obviously everybody wants to avoid their shame and their pain. So yes, we all want a sense of spirituality. We all are driven. It's one of the human needs, in fact. And it helps us to rise above the raw and the messy side, I guess, of our human existence, which is particularly prevalent right now because we're facing such a threat to our way of life currently. So, but it can be, as I said, an escape route where people disappear into it without actually engaging with the raw and messy part of ourselves. And until we fully face that and made peace with it, we can bypass, which of course is the term used here. So we are therefore using what he calls the absolute truth, so a higher truth, a sort of transcendent truth, to disparage or dismiss relative human needs, the needs for security, certainty, connection. We can also avoid our own feelings, our own problems and relational difficulties, and as I've already addressed, the developmental deficits, so a position whereby you haven't actually gone through the correct stages of development. You haven't become fully adult. So this creates, of course, a split between your psychological, emotional self and this spiritual, cerebral self, i.e. between the Buddha and the human, if you like. And it leads to a very one-sided kind of spirituality where one pole of life is elevated, the spiritual, at the expense of its opposite, the messy, the feeling. And absolute truth then is favoured over relative truth, the impersonal over the personal, emptiness over form, transcendence over embodiment, and detachment over feeling. And I see a lot of people who are dissociative, detached from their own experience. If I ask them, what do you feel in your body? They won't know. And so this is a really big problem. Now, where do these problems of connection to ourselves come from? They come from wounds in the childhood experience, and relationship wounds are the worst. So he has a heading here, relationship as crucible, which is a beautiful term. And I've often used it myself, that our relationships are the crucible for our development, if you like. They're where we sort of find out who we really are only in relationship to others. It's certainly a case for me until I had my first adult relationship. I really felt I was okay and I had it all covered, up to the age of about 19. that, you know, I had it sorted, I understood life, it was everybody else who didn't understand. And then you get into a relationship with someone and you find that their worldview is so different to yours, and you're challenged in so many ways to come up with the goods, and you find you can't. And, you know, relationships usually either evolve or they die. So relationship difficulty is another aspect of trauma, and you'll find if you've had childhood trauma, and I'm not talking about overt trauma necessarily, I'm not talking about physical sexual abuse here, although obviously that is a very serious trauma. Far more common are problems with relationship. So that's really the one I'm talking about here. So breaches in the context of past relationships. Now, people who are going to be the teachers for the spiritual enlightened movement often aren't engaging in that part of life. They particularly if they're, you know, from a meditating culture in the Himalayas, for instance, they might not have had to do too much struggling in modern day life with stress, with your boss, difficulties in paying the bills, and so on. And so we are actually being taught by people who don't really understand the full panoply of difficulties that we're facing. So what I would like to say is you are your best teacher, and not to necessarily put your faith in people who don't experience the same things that you do. Remember, most of our psychological wounding comes from failures of empathy experienced in childhood with our caregivers, i.e. usually parents. We're so vulnerable as children and dependent, and we require consistent, reliable and unconditional care. When we don't get this kind of care, we experience a kind of trauma that is stored in traumatic memory, and I've talked a lot about that. The traumatic experiences are generally benign, they're not deliberate or intentional. It's usually failures of connection when we needed it. So our parents didn't validate or reassure us enough, or at the required moment that we needed it, because they were preoccupied, stressed, or had learned behaviours from their own traumatic childhoods. A lot of this is transferred down the generations. But in this case, when we don't get what we need, we not only store that lack of attention, care, or validation as an unpleasant feeling or event, but we place these failures in the context of an internal self-referential narrative. In other words, you say to yourself, I am the problem, I must be inadequate, I am unworthy, I am hopeless, the world is terrifying, and others are unreliable. Now, in my next video, I'm going to talk about how this problem with attachment plays out in these difficulties with engaging in spirituality. But for now, that's plenty to mull over, isn't it? So thank you for listening. Join me again, and talk to you soon. Oh, and subscribe. Bye for now.